There are moments in life when you feel like you're standing at a dead end. No options, no way out. You've prayed, you've tried, you've fought, but nothing seems to shift. It's in those moments that you have to remind yourself, just because you don't see a way doesn't mean God hasn't already made one. Just because you feel stuck doesn't mean you are. Just because it looks impossible doesn't mean it is. God has a way of working in the unseen, behind the scenes, beyond what you can comprehend. He doesn't operate within the limits of human understanding. He's not confined by circumstances, not restricted by time, not limited by what looks possible. When you say, there's no way, he says, I am the way. When you say it's too late, he says, I am more than enough. When you say, I don't have enough, he says, I am more than enough. Think about the Israelites standing at the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's army. In front of them, an uncrossable body of water. No boats, no bridges, no escape. Their situation screamed trapped, but God had already prepared a way they couldn't see. A way through the sea. A way that didn't make sense. A way that had never been done before. And when the time was right, when their faith was at its breaking point, when all hope seemed lost, God split the sea and they walked through on dry ground. That's the kind of God you serve. A God who makes ways where there are no ways. A God who specializes in impossible situations. A God who isn't waiting for the odds to be in your favor before he moves. He's the God who moves even when the odds are stacked against you. Maybe right now you're facing something that looks like your Red Sea. Maybe it's a financial crisis, a diagnosis, a broken relationship, a dream that seems too far gone. Maybe you've prayed for a breakthrough and instead of things getting better, they've gotten worse. Maybe you've been faithful, you've trusted, you've obeyed, but the door still hasn't opened, and now doubt is creeping in. Fear is whispering lies. The enemy is trying to convince you that it's over. But hear this, just because you don't see it doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't. Delay is not denial. Closed doors don't mean the way is blocked. It just means God is leading you to a different one. Sometimes the way God makes isn't the way you expected. You wanted the job, but he let it pass because he had something better. You wanted the relationship to work, but he allowed it to end because he knew it would have broken you in the long run. You wanted the breakthrough to come now, but he's building your faith, your endurance, your dependence on him. God doesn't just make a way, he makes the right way, and he makes it at the right time. He's never in a hurry, but he's never late. He's strategic. He sees the whole picture. He knows what you don't know. He sees the detours ahead, the traps set by the enemy, the things that would destroy you if he gave you what you wanted too soon. That's why you have to trust him, even when it doesn't make sense. Think about Joseph. Betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned. If anyone had a right to feel like God had forgotten him, it was Joseph. Every turn in his life seemed like another setback, but what looked like setbacks were actually setups. Every injustice, every delay, every painful season was positioning him for the palace. And when the time was right, when everything had aligned according to God's plan, Joseph stepped into the purpose God had prepared for him all along. That's what God does. He uses the pit, the prison, the pain, not to punish you, but to prepare you, not to break you, but to build you, not to delay you, but to develop you. So if you feel stuck, if you feel forgotten, if you feel like the promise is taking too long, hold on. The way is already made. You may not see it yet, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Look at the story of Daniel, thrown into the lion's den for standing firm in his faith. It looked like the end. It looked like he was about to be devoured. But the same God who shut the mouths of lions back then is still shutting the mouths of your enemies today. The same God who preserved Daniel in a den is preserving you right now. When you trust God to make a way, you don't have to force things. You don't have to manipulate outcomes. You don't have to fight battles that aren't yours to fight. Your job is obedience. God's job is outcomes. Your job is faithfulness. God's job is fulfillment. Sometimes the way God makes isn't a path around the fire, it's a path through it. Look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't spared from the furnace, but they were spared in the furnace. The fire was hot, but it didn't consume them. The flames surrounded them, but they weren't burned. And when they came out, they didn't even smell like smoke. That's the kind of God you serve. A God who doesn't always keep you out of trouble, but keeps you in the middle of it. A God who doesn't always remove the storm, but speaks peace to you in the midst of it. A God who doesn't always answer how you want, but always answers how you need. Maybe the reason you feel frustrated is because you've been looking for a way out when God is trying to lead you through. Maybe you've been asking him to remove the storm, but he's trying to teach you how to walk on water in the middle of it. Maybe you've been asking for a breakthrough, but he's more interested in breaking something in you that's been holding you back. If God made a way for Noah in the flood, if he made a way for Moses in the wilderness, if he made a way for Elijah in the famine, if he made a way for David against Goliath, what makes you think he won't make a way for you? You are not forgotten. You are not overlooked. You are not abandoned. The same God who made a way before will make a way again. And when he does, it won't just be any way. It will be the best way, the right way, the way that brings him the most glory and you the most growth. So don't quit. Don't settle. Don't let the enemy convince you that it's over. Don't let fear make decisions faith should be making. Keep walking, keep trusting, keep believing. The way is already made. And in his perfect time, you're going to see it. Just because you don't see a way doesn't mean God hasn't already prepared one. His solutions often defy logic, like parting the Red Sea or turning setbacks into setups for something greater. Delays don't mean denial. Just like Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace, God is using every trial to develop you for your destiny. Trust that he is always on time. Sometimes God doesn't remove the challenge. He brings you through it. Whether it's a storm, a furnace, or a lion's den, he will sustain you and lead you to victory. Keep moving forward in faith. There are moments in life when everything around you seems to say there's no way forward. You've prayed, you've hoped, you've done everything you know to do, and yet you still feel stuck. You look at your situation and all you see is a wall, an obstacle, a dead end. But just because you don't see a way doesn't mean there isn't one. Just because it looks impossible doesn't mean it is. What seems like a roadblock to you is just a setup for God to reveal what he has already prepared. When the Israelites stood in front of the Red Sea, with the Egyptian army closing in behind them, fear took over. They couldn't see a way out. The sea was too deep, the enemy was too strong, and their strength was too little. In their eyes, the situation was hopeless, but God already had a plan. Before they even reached that point, before Pharaoh's army ever set out to chase them, before they ever felt trapped, God had already prepared a way through the sea. They couldn't see it yet, but it was there. And when the moment came, he parted the waters and they walked through on dry ground. How often do we find ourselves in that same position, feeling trapped, convinced that there's no way forward, overwhelmed by circumstances that seem beyond our control? Maybe it's a financial crisis, and no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to make ends meet. Maybe it's a health battle, and the doctor's report isn't what you were hoping for. Maybe it's a relationship that feels broken beyond repair, or a dream that seems out of reach. In those moments, it's easy to believe that because you don't see an answer, there isn't one. But that's not how God works. God doesn't operate on human logic. He doesn't need a path to exist before he leads you forward. He creates one. He doesn't need permission from circumstances to move on your behalf. He isn't limited by what's possible. In fact, he specializes in doing the impossible. He makes ways where there are no ways. He provides solutions that didn't even cross your mind. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his home and go to a place he didn't even know yet. No map, no details, no step-by-step instructions, just a promise that God would lead him. And Abraham went. He didn't see the full picture, but he trusted that God had already made a way. He understood something that we often forget. Seeing the way isn't a requirement for walking in it. You don't have to know how it will all work out to believe that God has already worked it out. Sometimes the problem isn't that there's no way, it's that we're looking for the wrong kind of way. We want the obvious answer, the open door, the immediate solution. We want the Red Sea to part before we ever step forward. But sometimes God calls us to take a step of faith first. Sometimes the way is only revealed as we walk. If Peter had waited to see solid ground before stepping out of the boat, he never would have walked on water. If the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant had waited for the Jordan River to split before stepping in, they never would have crossed over. Faith is walking even when you can't see the full picture. There are times when God's way doesn't look like a way at all. The path may not be clear, the answer may not be obvious, and the breakthrough may not come in the way you expect. But just because it's different than what you imagined doesn't mean it isn't God's way. Sometimes what looks like a closed door is actually God redirecting you. What looks like a delay is actually divine preparation. What looks like a setback is actually positioning you for something greater. Joseph's life is a perfect example of this. He had a dream of greatness, but everything in his life seemed to go in the opposite direction. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and thrown into prison, forgotten by those he helped. Every part of his journey seemed to scream that there was no way forward. But what Joseph didn't know in those moments was that every step, every hardship, every delay was part of the way God had already made. The pit, the prison, the waiting, it was all leading him to the palace. When the time was right, the way was revealed, and Joseph stepped into the very destiny God had promised him. The same is true for you. God's way is already made. The provision you need, the breakthrough you've been praying for, the answer you've been waiting on, it's not something that God has to figure out last minute. He isn't scrambling for solutions or trying to come up with a plan. The way has already been established. He's already gone ahead of you. He's already arranged the details. He's already positioned the right people, the right opportunities, the right moments. Your job isn't to figure it all out. It's to trust that he already has. That doesn't mean the journey will always be easy. Sometimes the way God has made doesn't look like a smooth, straight road. Sometimes it takes you through valleys, through storms, through challenges that test your faith. But just because the path isn't easy doesn't mean it isn't God's way. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the greatest victories. Sometimes the delays, the detours, the difficulties are actually part of the process that prepares you for where God is taking you. Look at Daniel, thrown into a lion's den for his faithfulness. To the world that looked like the end. There was no way out, no escape plan, no visible solution, but God had already made a way. Before Daniel ever entered that den, God had already shut the mouths of the lions. The way was made before he even stepped into the problem. And when the morning came, Daniel walked out unharmed because God had already gone ahead of him. What if you started believing that the same is true for you? What if instead of focusing on what you can't see, you chose to trust in what God has already prepared? What if instead of stressing over every unknown detail, you decided to believe that God has already worked it out? God's way is not dependent on your understanding. His provision is not limited by what you can see. His plan is not hindered by what seems impossible. You don't have to see how it will all come together to know that He's in control. You don't have to understand every step to trust that He is leading you. When you can't see a way forward, remind yourself that the way is already made. Before the problem arose, God had the solution. Before the need appeared, He had the provision. Before the battle started, He had already declared victory. He is not surprised by your situation. He is not caught off guard. He is not wondering what to do next. He already knows. And when the time is right, when the moment is perfect, when you are ready, He will reveal the way that has been there all along. Your responsibility is not to figure it all out. Your responsibility is to trust, to walk in faith, to believe that the God who made a way before will make a way again, because He always does. There are few things in life more frustrating than waiting. Waiting for an answer, waiting for a breakthrough, waiting for something to shift. It's one thing to wait when you know how long it will take, but it's another thing entirely when there's no timeline, no clear indication of when things will change. That's when doubt creeps in. That's when frustration rises. That's when the enemy tries to convince you that God has forgotten about you, that He's not listening, that maybe you missed your opportunity. But God is never late. He's never off schedule. He's never scrambling to make things work at the last second. His timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match your expectations. Think about Abraham and Sarah. God gave them a promise, a clear word that they would have a son, but then the waiting began. Years passed and nothing happened. The promise seemed delayed, and in their impatience, they tried to force it. Sarah gave her servant Hagar to Abraham, hoping to create the outcome on their own, but the child born from that situation wasn't the fulfillment of God's promise. That's what happens when we try to rush what God is doing. We settle for something less than is best. God wasn't late in giving them Isaac. He was waiting for the right time, the time that would bring Him the most glory and them the most blessing. Waiting isn't wasted when God is in control. What looks like a delay is often preparation. Sometimes the reason things haven't happened yet isn't because God is withholding them, but because He's working behind the scenes, arranging things, shifting circumstances, refining you. He sees the whole picture when you only see a small piece. He knows what needs to be aligned before He releases the blessing. If you received what you were asking for too soon, it might crush you instead of bless you. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of leadership and greatness, but instead of stepping into that promise immediately, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. Every step of his journey seemed like a setback. If Joseph had judged God's timing based on his circumstances, he would have thought that God had forgotten about him. But what seemed like delays were actually divine appointments. Each challenge, each hardship, each year of waiting was shaping him for the position he would eventually step into. When the time was right, Pharaoh called him out of prison, and in a single moment, everything shifted. But if Joseph had been promoted before he was ready, before he had developed the wisdom, the humility, the endurance needed for leadership, he wouldn't have been able to sustain the blessing. The timing wasn't just about Joseph's readiness. It was about the right time for the entire nation. God's timing isn't just about you. It's about everything connected to you. There are people, places, and events that have to align for the fulfillment of what God is doing in your life. That's why certain doors don't open when you want them to. That's why certain prayers don't get answered the way you expected, because God is not just working for you, He's working through you, setting things up for a bigger purpose. David was anointed king as a teenager, but he didn't take the throne right away. Instead, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, fighting battles, developing as a leader. If he had stepped into his kingship immediately, he wouldn't have been prepared. The throne wasn't just about the position, It was about the preparation. Every struggle, every delay, every moment of waiting was shaping him into the king he was meant to be. When it feels like God is taking too long, it's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to look around and wonder why other people seem to be moving forward while you're stuck. It's easy to compare timelines and assume that because someone else received their breakthrough faster, something must be wrong with you. But comparison is a distraction from trust. Your journey is not supposed to look like anyone else's. God's timing for you is specific, intentional, and perfect. What he has for you is not on anyone else's schedule. Sometimes the waiting is about developing faith. When everything happens instantly, you don't need to trust. You don't have to rely on God's strength when everything is falling into place exactly when you want it to. But when you have to wait, when you have to believe without seeing, when you have to trust beyond your understanding, that's when faith is built. That's when your relationship with God deepens. That's when you learn to depend on him instead of your own plans, your own strength, your own ability to make things happen. Look at Lazarus. Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus, asking him to come because their brother was sick. They expected him to come immediately to heal Lazarus before it was too late, but Jesus delayed. He waited, and by the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. To Mary and Martha, it looked like Jesus had come too late, but he wasn't late. He was right on time. He didn't just heal Lazarus, he resurrected him. What they thought was a delay was actually an opportunity for a greater miracle. There are moments when it feels like God missed the deadline. You prayed, you believed, you expected, and yet things still fell apart. The job didn't come through, the relationship ended, the opportunity passed, and you wonder, God, where were you? Why didn't you step in sooner? But what if the delay is part of a greater plan? What if God is setting you up for something you never even imagined? What if what you thought was lost is actually making room for something better? God's timing is not dictated by human schedules. He is not limited by deadlines, by expectations, by the constraints of what seems possible. When it's time, nothing can stop what he has ordained. No opposition, no delay, no obstacle can block what he has planned. And when he moves, things can change in an instant. One phone call, one opportunity, one unexpected shift, and everything can turn around. Think about Esther. She was placed in the palace, not realizing that God had positioned her for a specific moment. She wasn't made queen for her own comfort. She was placed there to save an entire people. And when the time came for her to step into that purpose, she realized that everything leading up to that point had been preparation. She wasn't in the palace by accident. She was there for such a time as this. What if everything you've been waiting for is leading up to a moment you can't yet see? What if the delay isn't a denial, but a setup for something greater? What if what seems like wasted time is actually divine preparation? There are things God has spoken over your life that haven't come to pass yet. Promises that still feel distant. Prayers that still feel unanswered. But just because you don't see it happening doesn't mean it isn't in motion. Seeds grow in the dark before they break through the soil. Babies develop in the womb before they are born. Just because something isn't visible doesn't mean it isn't growing. Trusting God's timing means surrendering your own expectations. It means believing that he knows what's best, even when it doesn't make sense. It means releasing the need to control the outcome and embracing the peace that comes from knowing he is in control. The waiting season is not a wasted season. It's where strength is built. It's where character is developed. It's where faith is refined. It's where God does some of his deepest work in you so that when the time comes, you're ready for what he has prepared. God is never early, never late, always on time. And when the moment is right, everything will fall into place exactly as he planned. There are times in life when the next step isn't obvious. You stand at a crossroads, looking ahead, and all you see is uncertainty. no clear direction, no clear answer, no sign that tells you exactly where to go or how things will turn out. In those moments, the natural reaction is to hesitate, to wait for clarity before moving forward, to demand proof before taking a step. But faith doesn't work like that. Faith is not about having all the answers before you act. It's about trusting that even when the path isn't clear, even when the outcome is unknown, even when fear and doubt try to hold you back, God is still leading you forward. Abraham knew what it meant to walk by faith when there was no clear path ahead. God told him to leave his home, his country, and everything familiar, to go to a place that God would show him. There was no destination revealed up front, no roadmap, no details about how things would unfold, just a command to go and a promise that God would be with him. And Abraham went. He didn't have all the answers, but he had faith. He didn't know how it would all work out, but he believed in the one who called him. That's what faith requires, moving even when you don't have all the details. It's easy to have confidence when everything is clear, when the doors open easily, when the plan is laid out in front of you. But real faith is tested in the moments of uncertainty, when the job offer hasn't come through yet, when the diagnosis is unclear, when the relationship is uncertain, when the dream you've been pursuing seems further away than ever. That's when faith has to rise above fear. That's when trust has to be stronger than doubt. Peter learned this in the middle of a storm. He and the other disciples were in a boat tossed by the waves, struggling against the wind, when Jesus came walking toward them on the water. At first they were terrified, thinking it was a ghost. But then Jesus spoke and Peter did something incredible. He said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." That was it. No further explanation, no guarantee that Peter wouldn't sink, just a simple invitation to step out in faith. Peter didn't wait for the waves to calm down. He didn't ask for the water to turn solid beneath his feet before stepping out. He didn't demand to know how it would all work. He simply obeyed. And as long as his eyes were on Jesus, he walked on water. The moment he focused on the wind, the waves, and the uncertainty around him, fear took over and he began to sink. But even then, Jesus reached out and saved him. That's what faith looks like, stepping forward, trusting that God will sustain you even when everything around you says you should fall. There are moments when God calls you to move before you have all the answers, to take a step before you see how things will unfold, to trust him even when it doesn't make sense. That's not easy. Everything in human nature wants certainty. We want a safety net. We want to see the whole path before we take the first step. But God doesn't always work that way. Sometimes he reveals the way as you walk. Sometimes the doors open as you move forward. Sometimes the answer comes after you step out in faith. When the Israelites stood before the Jordan River ready to enter the promised land, they faced a challenge. The river was at flood stage, overflowing its banks. There was no human way to cross. But God told the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant and step into the water. Not stand and wait for the water to part. Step in first. And as soon as they did, the river stopped flowing and they walked across on dry ground. The miracle didn't happen while they waited. It happened when they moved. That's how faith works. It moves forward even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. It obeys even when it doesn't make sense. It trusts even when the situation looks impossible. And it's in that place where human reasoning fails, where control is surrendered, that God shows up in ways we never expected. There are so many moments in life when fear whispers, what if this doesn't work? What if you fail? What if you step out and fall flat on your face? But faith asks a different question. What if God comes through? What if this step leads to something greater than I imagined? What if this uncertainty is the very place where I experience his power the most? Moses had to face those questions when God called him to stand before Pharaoh. In his mind, he wasn't qualified. He wasn't a great speaker. He didn't see himself as a leader. But God didn't ask Moses to have it all figured out. He simply asked Moses to go, to trust that the one who called him would be the one who equipped him. And as Moses walked in obedience, God performed miracles, parted seas, and led an entire nation to freedom. So many times we hesitate to move forward because we're afraid of making a mistake. We think, what if I choose the wrong path? What if I miss what God is trying to do? But faith isn't about having perfect knowledge. It's about trusting in a perfect God. It's about believing that even if you take a misstep, even if you don't have all the answers, He is still guiding you. He is still working. He is still leading you where you need to be. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It's not about never feeling afraid. It's about choosing to trust even when fear is present. It's about walking forward even when every logical thought says to stay still. It's about believing that the God who was faithful before will be faithful again. Think about Joshua and the walls of Jericho. God told the Israelites to march around the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day the walls would fall. That plan made no sense. Walking in circles didn't seem like a battle strategy, but they obeyed, they walked, they trusted. And when the time came, the walls came crashing down. Sometimes God asks you to do things that seem foolish. Sometimes He leads you down paths that don't make sense. But faith is walking even when the path isn't clear. It's stepping forward, knowing that the one who holds the future is already ahead of you, even making a way. The greatest moments of breakthrough, the greatest testimonies of God's power don't come from playing it safe. They come from stepping out in faith, from believing even when you can't see, from moving forward even when everything in you wants to hold back. God never promised that faith would be easy. He never said that the road would always be smooth. But He did promise to be with you every step of the way. He did promise that He would never leave you. He did promise that if you trust Him, He will lead you exactly where you need to be. So even when the path isn't clear, even when you don't have all the answers, even when fear and doubt try to hold you back, walk forward in faith. Trust that God is already ahead of you, making a way. Believe that what He has planned is greater than anything you could imagine. And take the next step, knowing that He is faithful, that He is in control, and that He will never fail you.